Hello everyone. Let me just start my presentation. Hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Daita Sergi, Education Programs Manager with AASHE, and I'll be the moderator today. It is my pleasure to welcome you all. As many of you know, AASHE's mission is to inspire and catalyze higher education to lead the global sustainability transformation. We are an international association with about 1,000 members spread across more than 20 countries, including Australia, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. We serve as the professional home for campus sustainability staff, but we offer resources for everyone in higher education: faculty, staff, students, administrators, as well as businesses and nonprofits that collaborate with campuses. We provide an extensive collection of online resources, networking tools, and educational events such as today's webinar and an annual conference and expo, which will be held this year, October 15 to 18 in San Antonio, Texas. Please visit conference.aashe.org for more information, and we hope to see you there. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone in the audience is on mute, but please feel free to ask questions or provide comments at any point during the presentation. You can either raise your GoToWebinar hand and we will unmute you and you can ask your question live, or you can also type your question or comments in the questions pane in the control panel on your screen. If you have additional questions after the webinar, please email them to education@aashe.org and we will get back to you. At the end of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to provide feedback regarding today's presentation. We take your suggestions into account when planning for future webinars, so please do provide this feedback. Please note this webinar is being recorded. If you experience technical difficulties or have to leave early, you and others can view the recording later. The recording, presentation materials, and additional resources will all be available in the Campus Sustainability Hub after the live broadcast. Today's presenter, Sonia Marcus, Director of Sustainability at UNC Asheville, is a sustainability specialist and lead accredited professional with a particular interest in cross-cultural and international dimensions of the sustainability movement. She currently leads strategic sustainability efforts at UNC Asheville as the first Director of Sustainability and chairs the City of Asheville Sustainability Advisory Committee. She's also an active member of UNC Asheville's Contemplative Practices Faculty Learning Community. So finally, it is my pleasure to welcome all attendees and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn to Sonia to get us started.
Okay, hello everyone. This is Sonia and I'm just getting my presentation in view mode here. Daita, please let me know if you can't hear me or if there's anything else that I need to adjust. So
it's all well.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you all for making time for this presentation. And in the spirit of the presentation, I'll ask all of you to consider turning off all your stuff and you know, muting your phone or maybe even turning it off completely so that texts aren't coming in. And, you know, actually, you know, logging out of your emails so that you're not even seeing the alerts, but really just choosing to make time for this presentation and for yourself, which is extremely important, as we all know. So today, I'm going to talk about some experiences that I've had, some experiments that I've been making over the last 4 years or so using mindfulness-based practices in the classroom. And I'm going to focus very specifically on the interdependence of these practices with the concepts of sustainability and socio-ecological resilience. I'll just point out to you that you should have a beginning poll available to you right now. We're trying to make this presentation interactive. And you can go ahead and cue the first poll, which is just a question about whether you're already making use of contemplative or mindfulness-based practices in the classroom. And you can just, you know, choose one or the other of the options depending on how much knowledge you have of this already. Okay, so then I'd like to go back to my presentation. Can you still see my presentation? Because I'm not seeing it on the screen anymore. Okay, I hope it's there. Great. Okay, so just a little bit of background on UNC Asheville and on my position here. So I do serve as the Director of Sustainability here, but I also teach. I teach a class on sustainability and food for first-year students, and I guest teach in various classes across campus. And just to provide you with a little bit of context for how this work takes place here, it is a small liberal arts campus, even though it's a public university, and there's a high level of engagement with environmental issues and sustainability, I would say, although it's certainly not universal. But like environmental studies, for example, is our second most popular major here on campus. And also in regards to the contemplative practice community, we do have a faculty learning community that I'm a part of that meets every term regularly, that focuses on contemplative pedagogy. And we have, periodic learning circles on different topics for other faculty members. We also hold an annual Mindful Campus workshop in the spring. If any of you are interested in participating, that's specifically for higher education professionals, whether it's staff or faculty. And it has broad participation from faculty from all different disciplines across campus. And then we also have an interdisciplinary certificate in contemplative inquiry now that's available to undergraduate students. We have quite a lot of students who are interested in mindfulness. In fact, there's a club that's dedicated to this, and they do an annual mindfulness festival here. So just a little bit about myself too. That's me there up in the mountains in North Carolina. I did have a meditation practice before coming to North Carolina, but it was pretty sad. It was a pretty pathetic meditation practice. But I had been exposed to some of the ideas, and it was of interest to me. But I do want to reinforce that I don't think you need to be a really stellar meditator or anything to be able to use contemplative practice in the classroom. And you don't need to be a scholar on Buddhism or meditation or the science behind contemplative practices either, because there are a lot of really basic practices that are accessible to anyone, and I think you can get really great results. So I do know that people are sometimes intimidated. And then just on my teachers, this is my teachers slide. I can say probably with confidence that there is nothing that I will share with you today that is entirely original work. It's all been gleaned from many different sources. And the one in regards to contemplative environmental education specifically, there's a lot of people who can't be cited because they're not necessarily publishing this work, but some of the ones that do, that are interesting are Chris Yule at Penn State, and Bobby Patterson at Emory, and Paul Wapner at American University, who leads a summer workshop every year that you might want to consider, and other writers who I've been influenced by, like Joanna Macy and David Abram. So these are some people that you might be familiar with, and I'm happy to follow up with you on some resources if you'd like to do some further study. So a word on what is or is not a contemplative practice, because some of you may have been thinking in the first poll, like, I have no idea what this is, and this is part of why I signed up for this webinar. Well, this is an image that's often used to kind of convey the wide variety of practices that fall in this umbrella or this canopy. So it really can be everything from movement education to artistic expression to journaling, or just ways of doing deep listening exercises, or things that are really much more ritualistic, or in some cases even spiritual or religious. But the most basic practice, which many consider to be part of the contemplative tree, would be just silence, allowing for periods of silence. And you'll notice that I'll do that on a couple of occasions during this webinar, which might seem a little awkward at first, but silence is also a really important part of teaching. So what brings all of these different practices together? I like this conceptualization, which comes from this text, Contemplative Practices in Higher Education. So whether they are analytical exercises asking students to examine a concept deeply, or an opportunity to simply attend to what is arising, the practices all have an inward or first-person focus that creates opportunities for greater connection and insight. And so for me, I think that if the reason I use these contemplative or mindfulness-based exercises is because I think they allow for types of insight that actually wouldn't be accessible otherwise in most cases in a classroom setting. I think they provide something that's categorically different than other approaches to classroom learning. So, and as I mentioned, some of the most basic practices, like just holding space for silence in a classroom, or journaling or deep listening, those are not ones I'm going to really introduce you to or share with you today, even though they're the most common in my classroom and probably in most others, just because I'm going to focus in this presentation very specifically on practices that relate for me to the teaching of ecological resilience and sustainability. And whereas those basic practices like holding space for silence, they're really applicable to any topic, and they work very well for teaching about sustainability as well. And then also, because I work in the classroom oftentimes with first-year students, not exclusively, but quite a lot, I've also developed some nature-based exercises around transitioning to college, which are not on this topic and not part of the webinar, but I think have been really helpful to me and to the students that I work with, and I'm happy to share those with you as well. Okay, so I'm just going to give you an overview of kind of how I understand this topic and why I think it's interesting. And these are the main areas that I'm going to focus on. So first of all, how do mindfulness-based practices or pedagogy, how does this pedagogy help to teach sustainability and socio-ecological resilience? And then I will share, and for each of these I'm going to try to share a practice with you in sort of abbreviated form so you can get a sense of what the practice actually is. So, and then next I'll look at how this type of pedagogy helps to actually build skills that are relevant to the work of socio-ecological resilience. And then we'll talk a little bit about how an understanding of socio-ecological resilience actually helps students understand mindfulness. And then finally, how an understanding of resilience helps to build mindfulness skills. So I see that about a quarter of you, incidentally, said that yes, you're using these practices in the classroom. And I just wanted to say and reinforce what Daita was saying at the beginning, which is that if you would like to make a comment live, which is best, but also in the chat window at any point about the exercises that you're sharing, that is very much welcome, or your experiences with them. So first of all, how is it that these mindfulness-based practices help to teach about sustainability? How do they actually help students understand these concepts? So I teach an overview, basic overview of socio-ecological resilience concepts in my first year class. And just, I'm sure that many of you are also teaching about this as well. But, on a basic level, what is resilience? It's the ability of a complex system to absorb disturbance or change while maintaining the same basic form and function, right? So it's different than, and I would argue more interesting and more complex than sustainability as an idea, because, several things about it that make it complex. There's no end state to resilience. There's no perfect equilibrium. There's no original condition that we're trying to get back to, that we're trying to, fix society so that we can get back to this. There is no going back. So in a lot of ways, I find resilience to be much more useful than sustainability in the classroom. That being said, for most of you who are teaching about this theory and practice of resilience, we can probably all agree that it's pretty complex, and it can be pretty heady and theoretical, and students have trouble connecting with it. It involves a lot of lingo also. I use a text called Resilience Thinking in my classes by Brian Walker and David Salt, which covers component concepts like adaptive cycles, fore and back loops, thresholds, dynamic equilibrium, and panarchy. But it's definitely a challenging set of concepts to engage with, and I say that as much for myself as for the students. So, as part of, what resilience represents, complex adaptive systems kind of progress through these different cycles within, that are kind of diagrammed here, and, phases or transitions, okay? So, phases of growth and accumulation, and then phases of reorganization leading to renewal. And one of the things that I want my first-year students to take away from learning about resilience is that in natural systems, there's a lot of redundancy built in that makes for the system's overall strength. So it's not so much about the way that the system is currently being stressed or its present manifestation in terms of how it's appearing to you, but about the underlying capacity of that system to rebound and adapt. So when we're thinking about, for example, the series of wildfires that took place in Western North Carolina this past fall, which were very significant, we shouldn't just consider the nature and scale of the disturbance itself, but we should also consider, or at least question, what the underlying resilience of that system is in the face of disturbance. And part of that is, I'm missing a slide there, a slide of a little seedling that's an acorn coming up from the ground, what the redundancy is that's built into that system. So here's an exercise that I'm going to introduce you to, a basic exercise, which is alternate nostril breathing. Okay, and you may be familiar with these exercises from yoga, if this is a practice that you maintain. What I will instruct you to do, there's the picture of the oak seedling, is to just relax into these practices and see if you'd actually like to try them out yourself. Give yourself a chance to actually experience what this is like. So take a comfortable seat in your chair and make sure your spine is straight and you feel that your heart is open. And relax your left palm comfortably in your lap and bring your right hand just in front of your face. And with your right hand, bring your pointer finger and middle finger to rest between your eyebrows, lightly using them as an anchor. So the fingers we'll be actively using are the thumb and ring finger. Close your eyes and take a deep breath in and out through your nose. Now close your right nostril with your right thumb and inhale through the left nostril slowly and steadily. Close the left nostril with your ring finger so both nostrils are held closed, and retain your breath at the top of the inhale for a brief pause. And then open your right nostril and release the breath slowly through the right side, pausing briefly at the bottom of the exhale. And inhale through that right side again slowly. Hold both nostrils closed, and then you'll alternate again. So you get an idea of how the practice works, right? We're not going to do the whole thing. Maybe I would do that for 5 or 10 cycles of that. Breathing out and then in through one nostril, closing off both nostrils, and then breathing through the other side. So in here are some of the questions that I offer for reflection while students are doing this. So I ask them, and this is on a day when they've been assigned to read resilience thinking. So they've been exposed already to these concepts. So I say, consider the resilience of the human body and its response to stressors, both internal and external. What conditions could or sometimes do overwhelm your system? What would your body be able to withstand? What are the factors that contribute to your strength? What deep root system do you have that allows you to access needed water in times of drought? What rigid patterns or responses have you developed that are difficult to dislodge? Where are you vulnerable? So I would give that a little bit more space, but in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of move things along. And then, you write down some reactions to that. I find it's helpful, particularly with first-year students, but all students, to have them write down some reactions to a contemplative practice so that they're ready to share when the time comes for sharing. Although you really don't have to share. A lot of times I just let them write down reactions in a journal and I leave it at that. So I'll share a quick poll with you right now about that practice. And the reason I'm sharing this poll with you is partly, to know whether you find this interesting, although it was a little difficult probably to judge on this accelerated schedule, but also to show you how it is that I ask students about their reactions to these practices in the classroom. So anytime I use a contemplative practice in the classroom, I have this as part of their, online Moodle assignment for the next class, is to actually respond to that particular practice and say one of these 4 possible answers. So you can feel free to answer, and I can tell you at the end, if you'd like, about how I tend to see those answers going. Okay, so I'm going to move forward in the presentation now. So the poll can remain active, but I'll keep going with my slides. Good. Okay, so now looking at how does contemplative practice or a mindfulness-based pedagogy help to build socio-ecological resilience skills? So what are the skills we're talking about here? For example, maintaining diversity and redundancy would be one particular way to actually build resilience. Managing slow variables and feedback. These are the kinds of skills that are going to be helpful to students as they actually think about, well, how can I make a change in a positive way? So I mentioned earlier that we have these faculty development workshops. One of the workshops that I led last year was using this book. It was kind of like a little, mini book club about a book called The Forest Unseen, which I highly recommend, by David Haskell. And what David Haskell does in this book is he actually kind of delineates this area in the forest that he returns to for a year on a regular basis. And it's sort of like I think a 10-foot diameter circle of forest, and he observes it very, very, very closely. And then he relates his experience about what he's been able to discover through this very close observation. And so as part of that practice, or as part of this learning circle, we also kind of adopted a little circle, a little mandala area of our campus to observe very closely during that time. And this is a skill that I think is very important to develop. And that we can share through a contemplative approach. Another way that I think skills can be built through these exercises, this is a really important one, is the issue of coping with pain and emotional reactivity from learning about sustainability issues, environmental issues. Many of you have probably experienced this, which is that students will get really upset about the things that they hear in the classroom, and they don't really know what to do with that pain. And oftentimes, or not necessarily oftentimes, but in many cases, it will drive them away from learning more, or it'll lead them to a situation where they don't feel like they can act. So it's a problem if we're avoiding pain. We have to actually share practices with students that allow them to experience pain in a healthy way. So, and one of the things that I think can also happen is that, when they become very reactive, they also see the issues as being very distant to them. They don't actually pull them in closer. They want to push them away. So the way Joanna Macy puts this, and I'm going to show you a difficult image on the next slide. Okay, so just prepare yourself a little bit. It's nothing that you haven't seen before, but it's painful to look at. So for example, when we show students in the classroom images such as this one, which is, of a bird that's been affected by an oil spill, it can overwhelm their system. And allowing for silence and reflection or contemplative practices actually can help them process that kind of grief and locate where it exists in their body and how they feel about it. So I really like what Joanna Macy says about, what happens when we refuse to feel, as she puts it. She says, the refusal to feel takes a heavy toll. Not only is there an impoverishment of our emotional and sensory life, flowers are dimmer and less fragrant, our loves less ecstatic. But this psychic numbing also impedes our capacity to process and respond to information. The energy expended in pushing down despair is diverted from more creative uses, depleting the resilience and imagination needed for fresh visions and strategies. So I'm going to share a practice with you here that I will use in the context of teaching about biodiversity and also teaching about habitat loss and about extinction. And extinction is one of these topics that, seems very distant to people, I think, in many cases, but is also extremely painful. Even when people aren't even aware that an animal existed, or a creature existed, it's still painful to know that it's become extinct. So this is a Kauai, this picture is of a bird, a Hawaiian bird, which was very common in the subtropical forests of the island until the early 20th century when its decline began. So I'm going to ask Daita to actually play you the audio of this bird's song, and I just want you to sit, and just kind of try to relax and breathe normally and just hear the sound of this bird and just see what comes up for you, and I'll give you a little bit of silence also after it ends. Okay, you can pause that audio now. So what I've come to learn, and this was a bird song that was shared with me by the head of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology at a presentation I went to, and I found that the song of the bird was really moving to me. And I learned a little bit more about its extinction, and which really came as a result of the introduction of exotic species like a rat and a pig and mosquitoes that were carrying avian disease, as well as habitat destruction. And so the bird was last sighted in 1985, and a last sound recording was made in 1987. And by the way that the person who shared this with me told me that it actually would have been a call and response between this bird and a potential mate. So the silences that you're hearing between the songs are where it's opening itself up to hearing from another one of its species and presumably not finding another one of its species. So I'll play that audio a couple of times through without necessarily telling people a lot about the background, just to see kind of how they're feeling about it and how they're reacting to it, and see if they can actually locate the physical sensations in their body that occur when they feel a sense of loss and sadness over ecological destruction. And then we process, and then we talk about, ways to address it, and ways to address biodiversity, and not get mired in sadness, and that we have to build skills to persevere and to repair. So, for example, in this same unit, we'll talk about this preserve, the Wainea Preserve, which is, where the o'o may have been found, which is still home to 127 species of flowering plants found only in Hawaii, a rare threatened snail, and several species of rare native birds, including 3 species that are officially classified as endangered, and they're still all living in this space. And so how do we, wrap our arms around places like this, intellectually, spiritually, and otherwise, physically, in a way that's actually going to support the flourishing of life and allow us to cope with the sadness of loss. Joanna Macy also has this interesting spiral of the work that reconnects. This is a diagram that was created by a friend of hers, but these, which refer to group methods that are designed to help people realize their own capacity to turn things in a new direction. And that the idea is that grief, anger, and fear and sadness are adaptive and healthy responses to what we're seeing and experiencing, and that we should honor those feelings and not push them away. So this cycle is interesting to me, partly also because of the way it relates to resilience, I think. And this was something that was shared with me through a presentation of Bobby Patterson's, although I don't know that it was necessarily her idea alone, but that there are some interesting parallels between the different phases or adaptive cycles within resilience theory and these different components of the spiral of the work that reconnects, which is really about allowing yourself to fall and allowing yourself to be sad, but then also coming up and seeing with new eyes and reconstructing and going forth, which is really what complex adaptive systems do. So I'll leave that to you to ponder further. Okay, and then how does an understanding of resilience concepts in the ecological field, socio-ecological resilience, how does it help us teach about mindfulness? So some of you may have an interest in teaching about the value of mindfulness. I'm not assuming that all of you do, but I think that resilience can actually provide some interesting entry points for that. So so how, do we understand, for me, I think it's really about understanding socio-ecological resilience as being meaningful at the individual level, at the personal level. And that even going a step further than that, that I see mindfulness as socio-ecological resilience at that level. That is what it is. So, these parallels that exist, I think, extend to the level of ecological disturbance. So the concept of pain at the individual level, I think, can be also understood as a form of disturbance, like we understand disturbance in a community or disturbance at a global scale. And the magnitude of threat that a particular disturbance or pain represents for a person has as much to do with the capacity of the system to absorb it as with the intensity of the disturbance itself. So this is kind of the distinction in Buddhist teachings between pain and suffering, right? So, you could potentially be an individual who's going through an omega or release phase in resilience terms, and that you're having a series of cascading disturbances that ultimately are actually disrupting your basic form and function. So this is a practice that I share that is an outdoor practice, and I made a little video of it in an effort to kind of try to relay to you what this actually looks like outside, because a lot of the practices that I do are actually based outside. So there's a little bit of shaky cam here at the beginning, and if you find it sort of nauseating to look at the video at the beginning or middle or at any point in between, you can just close your eyes and listen to the audio. But I'll go ahead and ask Daita to go ahead and play the video, and at the beginning I'll explain to you how it's introduced, and then you'll hear my voice come in, which is actually what a participant would hear as part of this practice. Just now, but was that I explained to people how a walking meditation works, so kind of how to walk slowly and mindfully. And then, participants will actually walk around in single file in this exercise through a green space. This is the way that I do it. And I have them follow me initially until I set the pace. And we start out at a pace that you would, be using if you were just getting from one place to another on campus. You weren't necessarily rushing, but you were, on your way to go somewhere. So, and then we slow way down, obviously, until stopping, and then, have this experience and then debrief afterwards. Like, what came up for you? What did you notice at these different scales of walking, and what registered for you about being the interbeing practice with the plant? really interesting things come up for people. I think that's the other thing about the contemplative practices, is that I think they all seem rather simple, and in some cases kind of almost silly. But when given a little bit of space for reflection, I find that students make incredible observations about the interconnection of living systems, about the role that they have to play in them, about their feelings of connectedness, that I just feel like I would never have solicited otherwise in the context of the classroom. So the last thing I'll share with you, and I don't want to rush this particular practice, but I'll tell you what it is, and then
Sorry
we can actually.
You, but, can you hear me, Sonia? You're
Yes.
not sharing your screen. Can you please share your screen?
Oh, it's showing for me. Is that shared?
Yeah.
Okay, okay,
yes,
we didn't miss, there was nothing missed. Okay. All right, so the last piece is how an understanding of resilience actually helps us to build mindfulness skills in students. And in other words, kind of how do we help students figure out how to manage, how to increase their happiness and reduce their anxiety overall through an understanding of socio-ecological resilience. So one of the practices that I use in this regard is one that's called the lake meditation, which you may be familiar with, which is a practice that John Kabat-Zinn developed, and I find that students really respond to it very well. And I'll give you a basic overview without doing the whole thing. But essentially, again, we ask participants to make themselves feel comfortable sitting in their seat and actually release their arms and release the things that they're holding and their gadgets and their, whatever they're using to take notes, and close their eyes. And then, invite people to have an image form in their mind's eye of a lake, a body of water that is peaceful. And talking about how the lake itself, likes to cool in low places, and that it seeks its own level, and that we try to bring people into developing all the detail around this image that's forming in their mind. So just really being in the presence of that lake. And then there's a further description, and I've shared all of these practices with you in a handout, which will be shared with you, I guess, at any time. I'm not really sure exactly where that goes in the GoToWebinar, but you'll have access to the text of these practices if you feel like you'd like to give them a try. But as you consider the image of the lake and its qualities, you also kind of consider the fact that there's this very deep stillness that exists at the bottom of a lake that most people can relate to because they've probably been in a body of water like this, that is completely unaffected by what's happening at the surface. So no matter what the weather is at the surface, or who's jumping in and out of the lake, or what's happening with the creatures that live in the lake, that the surface and the clarity of the lake can be disturbed, but that there's this core stillness there that's part of the resilience of that system. And it encourages people to think about the way that their mind works also, and to notice that they can have a lot of feelings and thoughts, kind of impulses and reactions coming and going as the ripples and waves, and they can notice those effects. But they can also recognize that there is a deep stillness beyond that, and ask them to identify not only with the surface of the lake, but with the entire body of water, so that they themselves become the stillness below the surface as well, which only experiences the most gentle undulations, even when there's quite a lot of activity at the top. And so I have students do this. This is just a talking reflection. You can do it in the classroom. It doesn't have to be outside or anything like that. And then just write down some reactions afterwards. And they tend to find this, again, very helpful. I often use it around times when they're getting really stressed out, particularly the first year students when they're having, like, say, midterms come around for the first time and they're really feeling overwhelmed. We'll begin class with a practice like this. And I do feel like the resilience concepts themselves actually help to anchor them in this kind of thinking, and that it can be healthy for them and for me as well to think this way. So at this point, I'd like to open it up a little bit more. So I'll ask you to actually, raise your GoToWebinar hand if you'd like to actually share a thought or a comment or a question if you'd like, or you can also type them into the chat window, and then we can go from there. There's a couple of other things that I'd like to share with you at the end, but in the meantime, we can just have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for sharing these exercises with us and your expertise. So I will also remind everyone to submit their questions through the questions pane. And here is our first question, Sonia. How does this work for urban settings?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So UNC Asheville is an urban setting. It's an urban campus, which you may or may not have been able to tell from the pictures that I showed you. So there's urban campus and there's urban campus, right? So we're smack in the middle of UNC Asheville. But at the same time, the campus itself does present some green spaces for us to work with. So those are ones that I do use as part of the practices. And I would say that it is of value to be able to find some spaces. They don't need to be extensive. They don't need to be ecologically intact, because goodness knows our campus isn't ecologically intact by any stretch of the imagination, or that intact even really has a meaning in the context of resilience. But to be able to, for example, hold on to the leaf of a plant, even if it's a weed, even if it's just, some vine growing on a fence somewhere, is something that you can do pretty much in any urban setting. So I would say those kinds of practices are still important points of connection. And then there are many practices that, don't involve, time in nature. I will say, though, that we did have a very robust conversation at the summer workshop I went to with other educators who are using contemplative practice to teach environmental topics about whether or not it's important for students to be able to experience beautiful places, for students to be able to be immersed in an environment which is not simply human dominated, in order to have real feelings of deep connection to living systems. And I would say that I think there's great arguments to be made all around in regards to that, but I would tend to think that, yes, I don't know that that's the only way that you can feel connected to living systems, but that is an important component of the education that we provide to students, even if it isn't part of their day-to-day experience.
Thank you so much. We also have a question and a raised hand, so I will go to Olivia and see if she would like to ask her question live. Olivia, can you hear me? Can you talk? All right, maybe not. So I'll ask her question. Have you ever used this with athletes, as they are a group that is asked to tune into their bodies rather often?
Yes, definitely. And I tend to have a lot of athletes in the class that I teach. And I'm not sure why. I think it might partly be the time that I offer the class and the fact that it fits with practice schedules. And what I've found is that the athletes, more than others, as you note, are able to tune into their experiences in the body a lot more easily than a lot of other students are. And I have to tell you, I had the most dramatic results in last term when I was teaching the sustainability and food class on the topic of resilience from an athlete, a female basketball player, who was not signed up for the class for any other reason than, this fit her schedule. And she told me in one of her journaling exercises, like, this is the class that caused her the most anxiety of all of her classes, because she felt completely ill-equipped to address the subject matter, and she felt like, well, what am I doing here? I don't even know anything about the environment. And she was the one who really connected with this concept of resilience as being something that she could use personally in her athletic practice, and about that she could find the store of energy within her. and that, you know, the blows may come and go, but that ultimately she was capable herself of developing this inner resilience, not just the physical resilience, but the psychological resilience to allow her to be successful. And she had kind of, I would say, the most, you know, in her journals, like sort of the most like sort of epiphany type responses in regards to these exercises. So I think they're really useful that way. Thanks for pointing that out.
Thank you, Sonia. Have you had any negative reactions to these practices from students?
So I've never had any negative reactions. I've never had any students say, you know, flat out, I won't do this. As long as I feel like you bring a level of confidence when you introduce the practices, and you always, you know, tell people also that they can opt out and simply be quiet, you know, and take it as a moment of respite, as it said in the poll. They respond very positively when invited to just consider their own reactions and reflections on a topic. So no, never. The worst, I think, is sometimes the students will say, I was too distracted, or, you know, and so I just couldn't even focus on, you know, what you were sharing or what I was supposed to be doing. That would be the worst of it.
Great. Has anyone brought up issues with you because they saw this as religious instruction?
Yeah, so this is a question that a lot of educators, you know, will run into when they're thinking about whether or not this is going to go over well in their department or program to be using these practices in the classroom. And it's true that some educators, including myself, do have an interest in Buddhist teachings and practice that are outside of just our strictly kind of classroom personas, even if it's not like, you know, the only reason why people come to use contemplative practices at all. I mean, I think there's tons of people who make use of these mindfulness practices, even journaling. If you consider journaling, it's really not a religious practice at all. But, you know, I think I personally am very careful to separate the two, particularly teaching at a public university. I'm very careful not to draw religious parallels. I don't mention Buddhism or Buddhist teachings unless there's, you know, a very clear reason why that seems relevant to the conversation, but I don't think I've done it yet. And I don't ask students to draw on their own religious training as a way of getting access to these practices, because I don't want anyone to feel left out who doesn't necessarily have an established, you know, ritual surrounding religion. So I think they're really very secular in nature, and I do know that there's been some kind of I guess noise, I would say, in certain states about the use of these practices in K-12 classrooms, and it being seen somehow as like anti-Christian. And I really think that's more, you know, that's more about politics than it's about anything else. Because when you're asking students in a classroom to just sit and breathe and you know, tune into their bodies and allow passing thoughts to be let go, I don't see that as a threat to anybody's religion. And I haven't had any administrators actually suggest that. It's more like an internalized fear that people have, as you know, that people are going to question it for that reason. So there's just a few last things that I'd like to share with you. One is that a colleague and I are going to be doing a different presentation at the AASHE conference if you'd like to join us on this topic, but with more of an academic background and kind of context for the practices. So that'll be interesting, and then you'll also hear from Lissy Goralnik presenting on that topic. And then let's see, I wanted to share this with you as well, which is this is the advertisement, the web-based advertisement for that contemplative environmental studies workshop that I participated in over the summer a couple of years ago with Paul Wapner from American University. This was wonderful. This was a really wonderful experience, a week-long program in Taos, New Mexico. I highly recommend it. You can see on the right there, there's a link I think it's Earth Love Go. You can sign up for the updates on the workshop there, or you can contact Paul Wapner directly for further information about it. I don't think the dates have been chosen for next year, but it does tend to take place annually toward the end of July, beginning of August, or it might be first week in August. And he brings in a number of educators and mindfulness practitioners who aren't necessarily higher education faculty members to explore this topic in a setting where you really have the time and the space to really practice yourself. And I found for myself that this really helped to jumpstart both my personal practice, but also my commitment to using the practices in the classroom. It made me feel more comfortable about offering them, because at first there's definitely kind of the stage fright component to it, which is like, this feels really weird for me to be reading this guided meditation. So just lastly, just a quick story about what I feel like this has brought to me, because as I imagine many of you can relate to this, but I also get kind of worn out in this work. And, you know, a part of it is also just taking care of ourselves. I had this experience where I felt like, you know, mindfulness practices really helped me a lot. And I'm just going to describe it to you briefly, but essentially I was in the woods, and it was the middle of the winter, and I saw this quince tree that was blooming in the middle of the winter. And maybe you've seen something like this before where you live, where just because the climate is completely out of whack, you see things happening phenologically that aren't supposed to be happening, right? And I immediately felt this terrible sense of despair. And I just thought, wow, the whole world is totally messed up. You know, this is crazy. How sad. And I really feel like the mindfulness practices, when I stopped and just said, I'm just going to sit with this, just observe how I'm feeling, and just see where it takes me, I realized that I could still see the beauty in this. I could still see how beautiful this thing was, even though, you know, in the context of why it was happening, the truth was that it was beautiful. And that there's a beauty in participating in the care of a system that is sick, in the way that it's also beautiful to care for human beings who are sick and ailing, and maybe even dying. And that there's a nobility in that, and there's a beauty in that, and that it can be celebrated. And that brought me a lot of hope and joy. And so I feel like that's as much why I do this as anything else. So, but with that, I'll leave you and say, feel free to be in touch. Feel free to use the practices that I've shared with you, or ask further questions about them at any time. And I wish you all lots of luck in your work.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today. Before we conclude, I also want to remind everyone about our webinar next week on September 13th, titled Generating and Maintaining Hope and Agency Through Sustainability Education. This webinar will describe research related to finding heart through sustainability education and to motivate activating hope and agency among students. And I think it's a great webinar to come after today's webinar. So you can learn more about it and sign up on our website. And I hope you'll join us again. Thank you, Sonia. And thank you everyone for attending. If you have any additional questions, please email them to education@aashe.org. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the recording of today's webinar, Sonia's slides, and the additional resources that were shared, the video and the document, will be available in the Campus Sustainability Hub tomorrow, and you will receive a notification once they're uploaded. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.